发展。
If you can dance this tango better than my fiancé, I'll marry you. Right here. Right now. The room went silent. 400 guests froze mid-toast, their champagne glasses still raised in the air at the Ritz-Carlton Ballroom in downtown Dallas. The string quartet stopped playing. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. It wasn't just what Khalid Al-Mansour said, it was who he said it to. Naomi Bennett stood there, motionless, holding the shattered remains of a crystal flute in her trembling hand. She was dressed in the plain black and white uniform of hotel staff. A woman of color. A waitress. And now the center of a public humiliation orchestrated by one of the richest men in America. Khalid, a 47-year-old Arab billionaire CEO, known for his oil empire and arrogance alike, leaned back with a smug grin, his arm draped around the waist of Camilla Devereux, a blonde French supermodel half his age. He was already buzzed on imported whiskey, his ego inflated by the cheers of his elite circle. "Come on now," he sneered, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "Show us what you've got. Unless you don't know how to dance." Figures. Laughter erupted. Not from everyone, but from enough of them. Enough to make Naomi feel like she'd shrunk into the polished marble beneath her feet. But then, she looked up. Not with shame. Not even anger. Just stillness. Calm. A strange kind of power filled the space between her and the man who thought he owned the room. "I accept," Naomi said quietly, her voice steady. "But on one condition, you keep your word, even if it was a joke." And in that moment, the mood shifted. The air changed. Because what no one at that glittering table knew was that they were about to witness one of the most powerful black stories ever told. Not with words, but with movement. If you're ready for a story that flips power on its head, stay with us. What comes next will leave you speechless. For most of the guests, Naomi Bennett had always been part of the background, efficient, invisible, replaceable. The kind of person you thank with a nod if you're polite, or ignore completely if you're not. She'd worked at the Ritz-Carlton for almost 5 years. Never late. Never in the way. Just another face in the revolving door of service staff. But the woman now standing at the center of that ballroom was anything but ordinary. She had the kind of presence that didn't demand attention, it earned it. Her skin glowed with a rich espresso tone, her posture straight, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised. She was in her mid-30s, but with the kind of timeless beauty that could never be pinned down to a number. Tall, lean, and graceful, Naomi moved like someone who understood rhythm, not just with her body, but with her soul. Still, no one knew her story. Some assumed she was just another hardworking woman trying to make ends meet. Others, the more cynical types, figured she was the kind of person who never aimed higher. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Naomi had lived a life few would believe. And up until tonight, she had kept it all buried beneath layers of silence and survival. Not because she was ashamed, but because she was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. And this moment, this ridiculous challenge, spoken in arrogance and prejudice, was exactly what she had been preparing for. Because sometimes, justice does not come in the courtroom or through headlines. Sometimes, it steps quietly onto a dance floor. As she walked toward the DJ, every eye followed her. Some with curiosity, others with doubt. A few with a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just that she had accepted the dare, it was how she had done it. No anger. No shouting. Just a quiet promise that something was about to shift. Behind the calm exterior was a woman who had known what it felt like to be underestimated. To be labeled. To be cast aside because of the color of her skin. But Naomi Bennett wasn't broken. She was focused. And tonight, the world would see that the person they thought they knew was only the surface of something much deeper. Something that was about to rise. Camilla Devereux stepped forward with the confidence of a woman who believed the spotlight belonged to her. She was stunning, no one could deny that. Tall, blonde, and sculpted like a runway model, she moved with the grace of someone who had spent her life being admired. Cameras followed her at every red carpet, her Instagram boasted nearly 10 million followers, and tonight, She wore a dress that cost more than most people's annual salary. As she adjusted her diamond necklace and gave Khalid a wink, her smile turned smug. The audience responded with polite applause, the kind reserved for someone already assumed to be the winner. Camila leaned toward the DJ, whispered something, and the first notes of Por una cabeza filled the ballroom. She began to dance. At first glance, her movements were polished, even seductive. Years of casual ballroom classes and music video cameos had given her just enough training to perform the basics. She swayed her hips, arched her back, and played to the crowd with perfectly timed poses. Men in the audience nodded approvingly, some whistled, others clapped mid-song. But for all her poise, something was missing. There was no connection to the music. No story. No soul. Her dance felt like a performance, not a passion. It was rehearsed, not lived. She treated the floor like a stage and the music like background noise. Still, she smiled as if she had already won. When the music faded, the applause returned, louder than before, but not unanimous. Some clapped because it was expected. Others because she was beautiful. A few, though, exchanged looks. They saw what others didn't. Camila stepped back beside Khalid, her chin high, her expression daring. "Your turn," she said, barely glancing at Naomi. Khalid chuckled. "You sure you still want to do this?" But Naomi didn't answer. She didn't even blink. She simply walked to the center of the floor, as the last notes of Camila's dance faded into silence. She wasn't dressed for performance. She wasn't draped in jewels or custom couture. But as she stood there in her simple black uniform, barefoot, still holding the echo of a shattered glass in her memory, Naomi Bennett looked like something else entirely. Not a competitor. Not a servant. But a storm that had just stepped into still water. And the room had no idea what was about to hit them. The room fell into a strange kind of silence. Not quiet, but breathless. Naomi stood alone on the dance floor, her hands at her sides, eyes closed, as the opening notes of the tango began again. It wasn't the same version Camila had chosen. This one was deeper, slower, aider, like a whisper from a forgotten world. She didn't rush into movement. She let the music reach her. Let it find her ribs, her spine, her shoulders. And then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, she moved. The first step was simple, barely a shift of weight. But the second was a story. Naomi didn't dance to impress. She danced to remember, to remind, to reclaim. Each step spoke. Each breath answered. Her body glided across the floor with a grace so natural, it felt like gravity had made a private deal with her. When she turned, the air itself followed. Her feet never stomped, they floated, pressed, kissed the floor with purpose. And then came the turn. Not with journalists or photographers, though plenty were waiting outside, but with former employees, former business partners, and a few quiet faces who had once worked behind the scenes, just like Naomi had. They sat in the wooden benches, watching the man who once towered over them now shrink behind a polished defense table. Khalid Al-Mansour looked smaller than anyone remembered. The expensive suits were gone. His hair grayer. His hands clasped tight in his lap. The arrogance that had once followed him into every room like a scent had faded. The judge looked down at him with tired eyes. "Mr. Al-Mansour," he said, voice steady, "you are being sentenced to 27 years in federal prison for tax fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. You will not be eligible for parole." Khalid didn't speak. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but the billionaire didn't react. The courtroom was silent as the gavel fell. Outside, news cameras flashed. Commentators spoke in hurried tones. But inside, there was only the stillness that follows a storm. Naomi wasn't there in person. She didn't need to be. She was across town, in a studio filled with mirrors and music, guiding a group of young dancers through a warm-up. She'd watched the verdict earlier that morning on a small TV in the corner of the room. She hadn't smiled, hadn't cried, just watched. And when it was done, She turned off the television and returned to the kids waiting at the bar. Because Khalid's downfall wasn't her victory. Her victory had already happened. It was in the way her students stood taller when they danced. In the fact that her name no longer lived in a headline about scandal, but in articles about impact. It was in the messages she received from women around the country, saying, "Thank you for not staying silent." Khalid had tried to buy silence, build walls, use his power to rewrite what people remembered. But in the end, truth wrote its own version. And it wrote his ending with clarity. Naomi didn't need to see him behind bars to feel peace. She only needed to know the system that once failed her finally listened. That evening, Naomi stood alone on the rooftop of her studio, looking out over the Harlem skyline. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the buildings, the golden hour washing the city in a quiet glow. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath, letting the air fill her lungs and release the weight she had carried for far too long. She thought about the years she had spent invisible, walking through doors where she was only allowed to serve, not speak. The moments she swallowed rage just to keep her job. The nights she questioned if the truth would ever be enough. But she never gave up. Naomi had learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes justice doesn't come quickly. Sometimes, you have to wait. You have to keep moving forward, even when the world tells you to sit still. You have to let go of revenge and hold on to something stronger, dignity. Because dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It simply endures. Through failure. Through betrayal. Through silence. And when the time is right, it speaks. Not to destroy, but to reveal. Naomi never set out to ruin Khalid. She set out to reclaim her story. And in doing so, she gave voice to thousands who had been pushed aside, talked over, or shut out entirely. She didn't win with fists or fury. She won with patience, resilience, and the unshakable belief that truth is louder than lies. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt invisible, or if you've ever been told that your dreams were too big for someone like you, remember Naomi's story. Let it remind you that being quiet doesn't mean you're weak, and that walking away with your head held high is sometimes the most powerful move of all. Because in the end, the world doesn't remember who shouted the loudest. It remembers who stood the longest. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of the strength we all carry deep down, take a second to share it. Leave a comment. Subscribe. Join us for more real stories about real people who refuse to be erased. Because this isn't just another drama. This is a black story. And it deserves to be seen. She reached into her other pocket and pulled out a slim silver USB drive. This contains over 2 years of audio recordings. Board meetings. Hiring decisions. Private conversations. I've documented every racially biased rejection, every off-the-record remark, every policy built to keep people who look like me out of positions of power. Khalid looked at her now not with arrogance, but fear. I didn't just serve drinks in this hotel, Naomi said. I served justice. Quietly. Patiently. Until the moment came when the truth could no longer be denied. Silence blanketed the ballroom again. Not out of discomfort, but out of respect. Because they weren't just looking at a woman who danced beautifully. They were looking at a woman who had danced her way into the heart of a billion-dollar empire and dismantled it from within. Just as Naomi's final words settled into the silence, the ballroom doors swung open with a force that made the chandeliers tremble. 2 sharply dressed men in suits stepped into the room, followed by a tall woman holding a leather-bound case. Every head turned. The taller man stepped forward and flashed his badge without hesitation. Special Agent Lewis. Federal Bureau of Investigation. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Naomi didn't flinch. Neither did Khalid, at first. Agent Lewis scanned the room, his tone even but cold. We have warrants for the arrest of Khalid al-Mansour on charges including tax evasion, corporate fraud, and obstruction of justice. We are also executing a federal seizure of all properties and assets linked to al-Mansour Global Holdings. Khalid blinked rapidly, still frozen in place. "This is a mistake," he said hoarsely. "I have lawyers. I have rights." "You also have a long paper trail," Agent Lewis replied flatly. "And thanks to testimony and evidence provided by Miss Naomi Bennett, we have what we need to move forward." The crowd began to murmur, phones now raised. Guests who had come for champagne and selfies were now recording a federal takedown. Some stepped back. Others leaned in, as if watching a live episode of a crime drama. Khalid's voice cracked. "This is ridiculous. I am a respected businessman." "No," Naomi said softly, stepping beside Agent Lewis. "You are a man who used power to protect prejudice. And you did it thinking no one would ever call you out." The woman with the case stepped forward and opened it, revealing a stack of documents and a laptop. "We have evidence of offshore accounts, falsified tax records, and email chains linking Mr. Al-Mansour to discriminatory hiring practices," she explained. "As of this morning, all associated accounts have been frozen." Khalid took a step back, then another. His face, once smug and unshakable, now looked like glass about to shatter. And then came the cuffs. Agent Lewis moved swiftly, reading Khalid his rights as he secured the silver restraints around his wrists. The room held its breath. Naomi didn't smile. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Because in a world where power often protects the powerful, sometimes it takes someone who was never supposed to be seen to bring it all crashing down. As the handcuffs clicked into place and Khalid Al-Mansour stood frozen in disbelief, the room remained eerily silent. But then, from the edge of the crowd, came the sharp, unmistakable sound of heels against marble. Camila Devereux stepped forward, her posture elegant but her face pale. Gone was the confident sparkle in her eyes. Gone was the amused smirk she had worn all evening. She stood there, hands trembling slightly, her diamond bracelet catching the light like a reminder of everything she thought she wanted. She looked at Khalid, really looked at him, for the first time in that entire night. "I thought I knew who you were," she said, her voice clear but heavy. "I thought I was marrying a man with power. A man with influence. A man who played hard, but fair." Khalid didn't respond. His silence said more than words ever could. Camila's eyes filled with something that was not quite sadness, more like realization. "You mocked that woman. You belittled her in front of everyone. And when she showed strength, you tried to bury it." She reached for her left hand. Slowly, with no drama, no theatrics, she slid off the diamond engagement ring Khalid had given her just 6 months earlier. A ring that had been featured in luxury magazines and fashion blogs. A ring she once believed meant status. But now, it meant shame. She let the ring fall to the floor. It hit the marble with a dull, echoing clink, so small, yet so final. "I'm not marrying you," she said, loud enough for every guest to hear. "I refuse to build a life on arrogance, racism, and lies." Naomi watched from the side, expression unreadable. But as Camila turned to her, something shifted. "I owe you an apology," Camila said, her voice quieter. "Not just for tonight, but for every time I looked through someone like you and never saw them." Naomi gave a small nod. No gloating. No pride. Just acknowledgement. Camila took a deep breath, turned on her heels, and walked away. Past the guests. Past the cameras. Out of the fantasy she had built, and into something real. The room exhaled. Because in that moment, someone chose integrity over image. And that, too, was a kind of revolution. 2 weeks later, Naomi Bennett stood under the bright lights of Lincoln Center, but this time, she wasn't wearing a server's uniform. She stood in a flowing black gown, her hair pulled back, her poise unshaken, facing a crowd of thousands. The American Dance Foundation had just awarded her the Courage Through Art honor, a rare recognition reserved for those who used their gifts not only to move an audience, but to move a culture. The ceremony was quiet, elegant. No flashing paparazzi, no staged drama. Just respect. Naomi stepped to the microphone, her heels clicking softly against the polished stage. I didn't come here tonight for applause, she said. I've already heard the kind that's hollow. A few in the crowd chuckled softly. She paused, let the silence work its way back in. I came here because I believe dance is more than movement. It's memory. It's truth. It's how we speak when we're not allowed to speak. She looked out at the faces watching her. Artists, students, teachers, strangers. For years, I danced because I loved it. Then I stopped because the world told me I wasn't enough. Not because of talent, but because of skin. The room didn't move. No one dared look away. But I'm here now, she continued. Not just because I survived, but because I refused to disappear. She held up the award, a glass sculpture in the shape of a dancer mid-turn. This doesn't belong to me alone, she said. It belongs to every young black girl told to shrink herself. To every artist pushed off stage before her story could be told. Behind the curtain, a stage manager signaled her wrap-up. Naomi smiled. One more thing, she said. I'm reopening the Bennett studio. This time in Harlem. It will be a place where kids from overlooked communities can learn dance for free. No auditions. No titles. Just a place to move. To express. To belong. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for her past. It was for her future. Because Naomi Bennett hadn't just returned to the stage. She had claimed it. Not as a comeback, but as a declaration. 6 months later, the courtroom was packed. A spin so fluid, so controlled, that for a second, time seemed to slow. Her black curls lifted with emotion, catching the chandelier light like a burst of flame. Her arms carved lines through the air, painting stories of pain, of fire, of survival. Her hips moved not to seduce but to speak. This was not a performance. This was a declaration. The audience, moments ago full of laughter and whispers, now sat frozen. No one blinked. No one dared breathe too loud. Even the staff had stopped in their tracks. Dishwashers, bartenders, security. All watching a woman they thought they knew become something they never imagined. Naomi danced the way people pray. With her whole self. With history behind her and a future breaking through her fingertips. When the final note faded, she stopped in perfect stillness, standing tall, eyes forward. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The silence afterward was heavier than applause. It lasted long enough to make people uncomfortable. And then, one clap. Then, another. And another. And in seconds, the ballroom exploded. People stood. People shouted. People wept. Because somehow, in less than 3 minutes, a black waitress from the corner of the room had shattered the ceiling they didn't even know was there. She didn't just win the challenge. She rewrote what it meant to be seen. When the applause finally died down, the room was left in stunned silence once again. But this time, for a different reason. Naomi hadn't just danced. She had revealed something most people in that room had never felt before. Reverence. Not for wealth. Not for status. But for raw, unfiltered truth. Khalid Al-Mansour, who had started the night as the king of the room, now looked like a man trying to piece together a reality that had just cracked beneath his feet. He stared at Naomi, searching for a mask, a trick, a glitch in the illusion. That wasn't just luck, he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. Where did you learn to dance like that? Naomi turned slowly to face him, her breathing calm, her expression composed. You want the short answer? She asked, her voice smooth and even. He nodded, still dazed. Broadway, she said simply. 10 years ago, I was the lead dancer in a Tony-nominated tango revival. I trained at Juilliard. I toured internationally. For a while, I was known as the girl who brought fire to the stage. Murmurs swept through the crowd like a gust of wind. Broadway. Juilliard. This woman, this server? Guests who had spent the evening pretending not to notice her were now scrambling to remember if they had ever seen her face before. Maybe in a poster, a magazine, or a viral video they had scrolled past without knowing. But Why are you here? Camila asked, her voice cracking for the first time that night. If you're who you say you are, why are you waiting tables at a hotel? Naomi tilted her head, and for a brief moment, her eyes darkened with something heavier. Not anger, but memory. Because not every fall is clumsy, she said. Some are pushed. Gasps rippled through the room. I lost everything in a single night, Naomi continued. My reputation. My contracts. My career. All because of a lie that was easier to believe than the truth. Especially when it was told about a black woman. That word, black, hung in the air like smoke. And just like that, the story began to shift again. Naomi wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a dancer. She was a woman with a past the world had buried too quickly. But tonight, under the crystal lights of the ballroom, that truth had danced its way back to the surface. The air in the ballroom had shifted. What began as entertainment had turned into a reckoning. People leaned in now, not out of curiosity, but because they sensed something bigger was unraveling. Naomi looked directly at Camila, then at Khalid, and finally at the sea of faces that only moments ago had laughed at her expense. You asked why I'm here, she said softly. You asked why someone like me would be serving drinks instead of dancing on stages across the world. She reached into her apron and pulled out a worn, folded envelope. I've kept this for 6 years, she said, holding it up for everyone to see. A letter sent to me, anonymously. It included a copy of a conversation transcript. It took me years to verify its authenticity, years to connect the dots. But tonight, I no longer need to hide the truth. Camila furrowed her brows. What does this have to do with? Naomi didn't flinch. She opened the envelope, unfolded the papers, and read aloud. Richard Devereux, CEO of Devereux International Holdings. Former co-owner of the Bellagio Grand in Las Vegas. On January 18, 2017, he met with the hotel's head of security to orchestrate a false theft accusation against a black dancer. That dancer was me. A collective gasp spread through the ballroom like thunder. Camila staggered back a step, her face drained of color. That's my father. Yes, Naomi nodded. Your father destroyed my life because his son, your brother, had been dating me in secret. He didn't want a woman like me in your family. He said I was a liability. That my skin, my name, and my presence would ruin your reputation. Khalid remained frozen. Naomi continued. He arranged for a stolen necklace to be planted in my hotel room. The security team discovered it the next morning, and I was fired before noon. My name spread like wildfire through the industry. No trial. No investigation. Just headlines. Camila stood there, shaking her head slowly, unable to form words. Naomi's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I was erased because someone powerful didn't like what I represented. And no one questioned it. Because I was a dancer. Because I was black. Because I was disposable. The ballroom, once filled with noise, had gone still again. Because the truth had arrived. And it had a name. As whispers rolled through the crowd like a quiet storm, Naomi folded the paper and slid it back into her apron pocket. Her posture never wavered. She stood calm and steady, like a woman who had spent years walking through fire and had learned not to flinch at the heat. But what she said next stopped even the whispers. And for those wondering why I stayed silent, why I didn't fight back sooner, it's because I didn't come back just to dance. She paused, letting the weight of that line settle. I came back with a purpose. Camila's lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came out. Naomi reached into the inside of her coat and pulled out a small black badge with silver lettering. She held it up, slow and deliberate, for the entire room to see. I've spent the last 3 years as an undercover operative for the Equal Rights Task Force, she said. A private initiative working alongside federal agencies to expose systemic racial discrimination in high-level institutions, particularly within hospitality and corporate leadership. A few people in the crowd gasped. Others took a step back. Naomi scanned the room with her eyes, locking onto the faces of people who had once ignored her presence. This wasn't just a personal mission, she continued. It was part of a larger operation. And you, Mr. Almanzor, she turned to Khalid, whose face had turned a shade paler, have been on our radar for a while. The billionaire stiffened. You're bluffing. Naomi smiled, just slightly. Am I?